Welcome to Rise from Switzerland, where the resorts are full of skiers and sunshine, but we could use a little bit more snow. I am Professor Demian Hodari of EHL Hospitality Business School, Lausanne.
And from lovely London, a very good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are joining us around the world. And thank you for joining us on Rise. We are going through these next normal days, which feel nothing close to normal at all. As always, Rise remains committed to you and committed to our industry, travel, tourism, and hospitality, to make sure all of us remain focused, remain hopeful, and remain very clear on what we need to do to ensure that recovery of our industry is strong, is safe, is sustainable, and is as swift as possible to get us all moving and get us all where we need to see the people and places that we love. Here we are, Professor Hodari. It's the second anniversary of the global pandemic. And for all of us at Rise, with our 100-day labor of love, we are nearing the second anniversary of Rise. It is incredible to see where our world is, and admittedly, the challenges we still face, yet the opportunities we have, which is why today is a special one. So whether you're joining us on our Zoom link, on EHL, I beg your pardon, I've got EHL on the brain, on our YouTube channel or Facebook, thank you for joining us. Professor, what is happening today and why is today so special on Rise?
Well, I think it's special just because you're here, but also because Liz is with us, and we're going to have a slightly focus more on Asia today, and I think that's great because it's an area that we haven't spoken about as much perhaps as Europe or the US during our show, and there's a lot of interesting things going on there, both related to the pandemic but also with the industry, and nobody better to speak to than her. We've also got Jan Freitag from CoStar sharing with us some STR data looking back over the last 2 years as well, so interesting things for our audience. Before any of that, though, as always, we like to first hear from our audience. So we've got today's poll question. Does it feel like the pandemic crisis, not COVID itself, is coming to a close? Please choose one of the following. All right, and we will share those results a little bit later in the show. But before that, Anita's got something to share.
Indeed. As we always do on Rise, we look at where in the world are. And I must say, Professor Hodari, sometimes it feels like not just where in the world, but what in the world is going on. We've been going through this for the last 2 years. We had no idea what the next normal would be. But as we say, there's very little that's normal about it. As we've all discussed since the last episode and our world is focused, we have another crisis that is layered on top of COVID-19, and that is the conflict in Ukraine. We spoke about it last week in terms of how this has affected air routes and how they're being redirected around the Ukrainian airspace. We've seen how a number of Russian aircraft and airlines are no longer being able to travel. And so when it came to what did we want to share with you, which we felt you really need to understand about this crisis, this I thought was incredibly important. When we talk about any country, we need to always keep it in balance. It's not just the country as a destination for travel, but it's also the people of the country as a source market for other countries around the world. So if we look at what's happening right now in Ukraine and the fact that it's very much, sadly, a conflict between two countries, one being Russia, as we knew in 2019 and before that, the Russian travelers were some of the highest valued in the world. Their yield, their spend could be 3 times the amount of any other traveler in the world. So countries around the world were thrilled to have Russians as visitors to their countries. What we've seen, however, and Forward Keys are magnificent in providing this data, the Russian traveling public is no longer traveling out. Not only are they not able to travel because there's very little airlift, but sadly, the stigma of being Russian is impacting those who are traveling into other countries. The same way that 2 years ago, we went through the heartbreak of people figuring that Chinese travelers were no longer welcome in their countries. If we look at the chart ahead of us, it's calling out the number of countries that are dependent on Russian visitors. So from Turkey to the UAE, all the way to Uzbekistan, all of these countries depend heavily on Russian tourists as visitors and revenue generators in their destinations. So with this conflict, Russian travelers are not traveling, all of these countries, these 20 countries listed here, are all going to suffer delays in their recovery because they're not getting their most valued travelers back into their destinations. We thought this was important to share from the point of view of understanding any country is not just a travel destination, but it's a population of potential travelers. And this gives an indication of 20 countries that are going to struggle with their recovery momentum simply because one of the most valuable travelers in the world, the Russians, are not able to go anywhere at this point in time. I wanted to share that.
It's great. It's an interconnected world and an interconnected industry, and what happens one place clearly has repercussions elsewhere, as we can see in a slightly different way on my data slide. Again, using the same crisis because I think it's just too important to neglect. I think hopefully a lot of people saw this already, but I wanted to share it just in case. This is a couple of days old, this data. This was the number of room nights Airbnb was reporting have been booked through its site in the Ukraine by customers who are not expecting to travel over the next few weeks, obviously, generating $2 million for Airbnb hosts on its network. And I think this was just reflective of two things. One, of the concern people have for the livelihood and safety of Ukrainians, and second, demonstrating our industry's continued commitment to help other parts of the industry. And so I think a lot of these room nights were booked by people like us that are travelers, people that are in the industry, tourists and travel agencies, but also just regular folk who recognize that this was an easy way to get money to people who desperately needed it. I did also see some chatter on some of the sites about that there are better ways to donate money through the Red Cross, et cetera. I think there are multiple ways to do it. I think this is an interesting one. I think it reflects innovation and new ways of thinking and should be used in conjunction with other established means of giving. But just a heartwarming, if you want, knowing that I do have a heart, Anita, heartwarming example of our industry coming to the aid of people in need.
And I must say, Demian, for just a second, if I can pause for a moment, you mentioned something really important here, and you said it on the intro to this slide about the interconnected world. And RISE has always been adamant in not taking political positions. We are here to share with our audience what we feel you need to know about what's going on in the world and how it impacts travel, tourism, and hospitality. What you've said is really important, because one of the great blessings of travel and tourism is the fact that it allows people from different parts of the world to understand one another, to find that common bond, and to care about one another. And that care is demonstrated mostly in crisis. So you're absolutely right that what's happening is that this groundswell of support is from people who have traveled to the Ukraine before, who've supported hosts in those countries. And it shows how our industry is one of the most compassionate. It is one of the most humanitarian, because at the core of our industry is creating a global community that takes the time and the trouble to understand one another wherever we are in the world. So I love that you've raised this, because it really is showing the glue of the industry at work at a time when people need it most.
I wish my kids could listen to this or would listen to this and see that somebody actually thinks what I say is important and valuable. Another person with something valuable and important to say is our Intel partner, Jan Freitag from CoStar, with his STR data snapshot for us. So over to Jan.
Hello, Rise. Hello, Anita and Professor. Good to see you again. Thanks again for having me back. We are now basically 2 years into the pandemic, and I thought it'd be interesting to look back at the data that we had 2 years ago and sort of see how far we have come. My updates are normally a lot more timely, but I just thought, with the 2-year anniversary, I thought it'd be appropriate to do so. So the first chart shows you the occupancy in China, and that throughout early January, you see already deterioration. And then ultimately, we saw the occupancy in China drop by basically 90% to a single-digit number. Think about that. The country of China is running a single-digit occupancy. Unfathomable, before the pandemic. And then, of course, things got worse for the global hotel industry. And we showed that in rather glaring terms with our eyeball charts, the chart we call the eyeball charts. And what we're showing you here are all 900 plus submarkets around the world, and we're shading in which submarkets had an occupancy of sub 25%. And you see that that red middle of the eyeball keeps getting bigger and bigger until in April, the vast majority of submarkets and hotels around the world ran a sub 25% occupancy. The April occupancy in the week of April the 7th for the US was 14%. So numbers that we've never seen before, that we hopefully will never see again. It was devastating to a lot of our friends and colleagues around the world. But even in that week of April the 7th, when there basically was no room demand and corporate travel had shut down completely and leisure travel had basically also shut down completely, the US hotel industry sold 7 million rooms that week. So there is always travel demand. The industry is resilient. And I think when we look back what happened over the last 2 years, that is clearly the takeaway, right? That the industry is here and is here to stay, come what may. In those early days and weeks in late February, all through March, all through April and May, I use this quote in my presentations all the time. It's called the Stockdale Paradox, made famous by the book Good to Great by Jim Collins. Basically juxtaposing two sort of opposite thoughts you have to have in your head at the same time to never confuse the faith that you will prevail with the discipline to confront the most brutal facts, which is what STR and CoStar have done over the last 2 years. But obviously, the faith that you will prevail reigns, and the industry has prevailed and will prevail. And we continue to report on the recovery. The number of rooms sold for many, many markets is now higher than it was ever. Room rates in many markets are now higher than they were ever. The leisure traveler has really saved the global hotel industry. People want to get away, and they want to go then come home and share the experience that they had when they went either abroad or went into their own country and visited it, as we've seen with a lot of leisure destinations last summer and the summer before. And that really gives me hope for the industry overall. So if you want to have one takeaway for the last 2 years, is that the industry is resilient, always was, always will be. Thank you so much for having me.
Okay, can I say it? He's a sweetie. I'm sorry. You were so smart in asking him to come on as an Intel partner, and to all of our Intel partners, thank you, because it's such a powerful way of making sense of it all, especially now as people have their predictions. It's so important. And I think as well, we're 2 years in, and it is public knowledge, so I don't think I'm breaching any protocols, but 2 years in, he also got caught by COVID and went through it. And we wish him and everyone who's endured it a very swift and safe recovery, because it is still with us. And it's magic that Jan, time after time after time, gives us the perspective that we need to make sense of the data and not lose the sensitivity of the journey that the data has actually been communicating for the last 2 years. So Professor, thank you to you for bringing Jan on board. Jan, as ever, you are magic, and we are enormously grateful for your being a partner with RISE through CoStar and STR.
I am going to disagree with something he said on my next slide. We're talking about faith that you will prevail. And I think it's more than faith. I think it's actions and strategic decisions and commitments, an ability to innovate and pivot. I'm using all these buzzwords, but let me show you what I mean on our next headline. So over the past 2 years, I've tried to share headlines, sometimes downers, but trying to reflect as well when I see something happening in the industry that I think is important. And here you have from a New York Times headline from March 3rd, hotels roll out the welcome mat to super commuters. And what the article was demonstrating was a trend that's happening amongst a lot of hotels and hotel companies is recognizing that demand patterns have shifted. We used to see Sunday to Thursday business travelers, and that's what most hotels and cities were focused on, that 2 to 3 day window, or 1 night, 2 night stays in that 4 to 5 day window of business travelers. And then rates would come down, occupancy would come down in these business city hotels, and you'd see a little bit of demand over the weekends, but really driven by Monday, Sunday to Thursday. And what they're noticing now is, obviously, we've talked a lot about leisure really driving demand, not just in resorts, but also in city hotels, as that's been a lot of pent up demand during the crisis. But we're also starting to see a change in business travel during the week. And what the article points out is that a lot of people are commuting to the city now for one day. They may not even be, it may be the city of which they used to live. They're living in the suburbs. They're not going to the office all the time. They're coming into the office for 1 or 2 days. And so they're booking a hotel for one night on a Tuesday night or Wednesday night. These are not people that are flying in for business meetings. These are people that are going to their home office that need to meet with their coworkers or maybe meet with some clients. And so we're calling them super commuters. And you've seen lots of examples, and I'm not going to point out all the specific companies, but things ranging from just making it easier and more welcoming for these people to book a single night using some co-working space or maybe parking, maybe the concierge service, special rates for people that book one night a month every month, become the first Tuesday of every month, etc. And it's just another example of the way hoteliers and hotel companies are able to adapt to the situation, find things that work, provide some value to their customers in new ways. If you had asked somebody a couple of years ago if they would have ever seen these kind of packages, there was no need for it. There is a need for it now. We've adapted, and it's proven to be successful. And again, just one example of the resilience, if you want, of the industry, because it is able to adapt and move forward.
Great call out. And it's interesting, to your point, so many people working from anywhere, it creates a new opportunity for traditional inventory to be reapplied. It's a really good one. So we're going to move on to another part of the world, and I'm going to share with you a headline which I thought was important because it's actually about, as I said, a layered crisis. We're still in COVID. We're still dealing with it in parts of the world. Parts of the world are very happily and excitedly taking their masks off and dropping their regulations. However, what we see is that other parts of the world are now looking at a fifth wave. We know that whether it's Hong Kong, China, Japan, Macau, South Korea, many countries are getting very nervous. Now, I spoke earlier about Russia, where 4 million jobs come in Russia from the Russian tourism industry itself. We now shift to China, and similarly to Russia, with China now being very, very conscious and when holding a zero tolerance policy when it comes to case numbers, they're continuing to lock down suddenly. So with that lockdown, we have to remember the fact that 1.4 billion people are represented by that source market itself. And if we look at it in 2019, there were over 155 million outbound travelers from China. That means all of the destinations around the world who traditionally took in Chinese travelers, whether it's people going from Hong Kong into Macau, into halfway across the world as well, all of those markets are now going to struggle. So all the countries around the world that were dependent on Russian travelers, on Chinese travelers, have to relook at this model in terms of how they're going to recover. For Chinese dependent destinations, the UNWTO came back and said it was worth $255 billion in 2019, accounting for 20% of international tourism spending. All of that is being stopped as it cannot go outside the borders in China itself. 61% drop in spending by Chinese tourists compared to 2019 levels when we look at 2020 itself. So the point of this is just to say, for every single market, every single destination, it's not just the opportunity for the destination to recover as a tourism economy, but it's the opportunity for that country to be able to help the world recover in terms of their providing inbound travelers to other destinations. These are the metrics we need to keep an eye on to really get a sense of one country might be feeling strong, taking the masks off, dropping the regulations, dropping the PCR tests. But the travelers who want to go out to the world have to be very conscious of where they're going, what the impact is in that country, and how they then go home. I just thought this was very interesting.
You know, what strikes me, Anita, besides just a great choice, is we've had this conversation before. We've been saying this for 2 years, and that's not just us, the industry. And so as much as we think things have progressed, people are still facing the same challenges, maybe in different parts of the world. And I was reading some articles about places that have been sort of spared the crisis, suddenly now in the throes of it as well. And a little bit linked to our poll, which I guess we'll see the results in a little bit, you know, is it over? I guess it just depends on your perspective. And I'm skeptical. I know where I would have chosen that. And just seeing headlines like this and data like this, and I guess when we speak with Liz in a few minutes as well, it's not over.
Absolutely. And I think to your point, we need to be very careful of becoming bored with the crisis and assuming that it's over, because there are many, many parts of the world that continue to suffer. And then carrying on to my video for this week, I wanted to put this forward as it was an important one, and you've already touched on it, Professor. And it's interesting how where each of us don't know what we're going to be showing in terms of our headlines and our stats, there's a convergence of thought here. We, as a global travel, tourism, and hospitality community, are a community of people who genuinely care. And it's forced people to become very innovative in not just how they're going to recover, but how they are going to care. And I wanted to show this little video clip that links back to Airbnb and what they were doing in terms of Airbnb providing those 61 million, the 100,000 rooms, $61 million worth of support. And how interestingly, it wasn't just Airbnb that responded, Airbnb's guests started to respond as well, utilizing the platform as a way of taking care of other people. But the question is, why would a hospitality company do this? Why would they put themselves forward and take a position on such an important issue that's going on in the world? And I thought this interview on CNN Business with Brian Chesky was absolutely beautiful. And we share it with you all now.
So what goes through your mind when you see pictures and videos of all of these people fleeing Ukraine who fear for their lives right now?
It's extraordinarily heartbreaking. It's incredibly sad to watch every single day. You know, imagine this was another era. Imagine Airbnb was around during World War II and a major global crisis had broken out. How would we want to have helped? How do we want to be remembered? And the answer was very clear. No matter what era it was, we would want to make sure people knew that we could do everything we possibly could to be able to help those people in need. This, to me, is a global problem. It's not just a Ukrainian problem. And I want everyone to know that we, alongside of the generosity of our hosts and our donors, are here to help.
I think we can share the longer clip later on our site, and also there's a thing called Google. So let's see what our audience had to say in response to the poll question we put forward earlier in the episode. All right, a little bit all over the board, but not sure. I keep waiting for something new to develop. That's where I put myself in that box today as well. I think this says two things. I think, well, clearly the majority think that, but nobody knows. Everybody's got different views, and I think it's all about the perspective you're coming from and the experiences you've had and where you are in the world. Where do you put yourself, Anita?
You know what's interesting? I'm an idealist. I have my rose-colored glasses as much as I wear black. But one thing I wanted to focus on is the third point. Not sure. I keep waiting for something new to develop. As soon as I look at that, I think, is that something new as in new mutation? Is that something new as in new news, positively? That's where it's interesting. Something new to develop can go either direction. And the fact is, we're in a wait and see. That's what's very conscious in my mind. That's what really hits me. We're in a wait and see world right now. And for the travel, tourism, and hospitality industry, a lot of people are waiting to book because they just don't have the confidence in the immediate term.
Yeah, and if you look at the data, only 13% are kind of thinking that we're out of it. You know, the rest of us are wondering. I actually interpreted number 3 to be more of the next variant, the next repercussion, the next problem, because I'm a pessimist, even though I wear light blue. All right. Thanks everybody for answering that. It's always interesting, I think, to see what our audience thinks and how they're interpreting this situation in the world.
Excellent. And so we now into Bliss. We now move into one of our favorite sessions in RISE, and that is our executive in residence. We are delighted to welcome the CEO of PATA, Pacific Asia Travel Association, Liz Ortiguera, who is joining us from Asia across the world. I think I should wish you a good evening, Liz, if that's the case. We are delighted to have Liz with us. PATA is a not-for-profit membership-based association that acts as a critical catalyst for the responsible development and recovery of travel and tourism to, from, and within Asia Pacific. It has more than 650 member organizations, including 82 governments, state and national airlines and airports, 71 hospitality organizations, 75 educational institutions, and thousands of youth members who are looking to PATA as a source of direction and inspiration for their futures in the industry itself. She herself is a senior executive with over 25 years of global experience and expertise in general management, even though she looks like she's 32. So she started working at the age of 7. She's great in terms of her expertise in marketing, business development, partner network management. She is passionate about innovation, business transformation, and community building. She is, as we always say, the exact right leader at the exact right time, in the exact right part of the world, and especially because she's a great cocktail when it comes to the industry she's touched: travel, lifestyle, technology, financial services, and pharmaceuticals. And in addition to being a great cocktail, she's a great gal to drink champagne with in Southeast Asia. So Liz, welcome to RISE.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me, Anita and Demian.
Yeah, thanks for being here. Liz, I'm just going to ask you the basic question, which is, if you've been watching the last 20 minutes or so, we're talking about how the more things change, the more things stay the same. We're talking about the same thing as we were 2 years ago. It's changed in certain parts of the world. We're confused and curious about what's going to happen next. Give me a 1 to 2 minute overview of how have things changed or not changed in the past 2 years, and what's your outlook now with Asia in focus, and what's your outlook for the next 6 months?
Well, let me first say that part of my perspective on that is also grounded in the fact my first career was in pharma R&D. And I think that the fact that we, even if it's 54% of the world right now that's been fully vaccinated, that's a medical miracle. And the work was underway like the past 10 years. So I think the fact that we were able to, because vaccines, coming from the industry, I knew it would take decades to develop them. So I think we're in an extraordinary position right now in terms of that progress, but it needs to be more even. And I think that, as you just recapped beautifully, in the last few segments, I think there's so much dynamism in our industry right now, whether it's what's happening in Ukraine or it's, the variants that are emerging, the opening of markets. I think it's, we were just saying earlier on that you need to actually keep on top of this every week, every other day. When you're traveling, you need to check on the status, the policies, and we're all finding ways to navigate. And I think, I'm an opportunist. I'd say I'm, 70% a business opportunist, grounded 30% in being a scientist. And so that's my mix of views. But, I would say right now for Asia Pacific, we are viewing with cautious optimism the opportunities. We're seeing markets opening up, which is great. You mentioned earlier, Anita, that travel is a force for good. It's created so many jobs across our region in particular. And, we're really keen to get those livelihoods going. And in Asia Pacific, there has been like a particular conservatism and cautiousness about, getting the right health and safety practices in place and the right protocols in place. And I think that will serve us well moving forward. And we're finding opportunities to open. We are watching with caution what's happening in Hong Kong. And, and the closure, as you mentioned, the recent travel restrictions in China. I was quoting earlier that the recent restrictions in China, in a country of 1.4 billion, they peaked at 1,100 Omicron cases across the country on Friday. So that's truly a zero COVID, strategy. And they know, they know that the 1,100 is indicative. In every country, there are cases that are not being captured, because they are less severe than before. So it's a different philosophy. And I think that, we do look for, with hope to, how things can open up this year.
Indeed.
Great.
To that point, Liz, I think you're in a unique position because you do represent, as I said, all the statistics of the countries, the associations, et cetera. COVID has created, sadly, a map of cases where countries' identities have been shaped by the numbers. But the fact is that there are parts of the world that are slowly opening up. There are those that are locking down again, and those that are being extremely sensitive because they know the impact to their nations itself. But you're in a beautiful part of the world where there are actually parts of the world that are incredibly excited to welcome back travelers and bring people back, respecting protocols itself. Can you almost give it a sense of, if you take the entire region that PATA covers, where do you find is absolutely look to book there for the middle of your year holiday? Those doors are still open. Where would you encourage not being discouraged about, if that makes sense?
Well, I tell people that actually this pandemic for travel has several silver linings to it. The fact that we are all much more wellness oriented, that we appreciate nature more, that we are doing slow travel. This will bode well for the industry in the long term. And it's very much, I talk about blended travel or multi-purpose travel. You've shared a couple of the new kind of forms of travel and bookings that are happening now. And I think that, all of that, I would say that Asia Pacific destinations very much have the antidote for the pandemic, the anxiety that we've been feeling for 2 years. Who doesn't dream of being, on an Asia Pacific beach, or looking at rice fields and beautiful mountain ranges. So I would say that you do your research, because the beautiful thing is destinations, we are looking at across the region. Governments are looking at educating people about the new discoveries, not the heavily trodden the places that might have been over touristed before. But we know that there's the interest for slower travel, nature-based wellness. And so, do your research, because there are some wonderful destinations that have been undiscovered. So don't just go to the super famous locations that everyone's written about, in the last 10 years. Find that newly discovered gem and do your research about, what it takes to get in there. And I think you'll be well rewarded.
It's interesting you say that, because I think another element about the recovery phase is that people who already have a relationship with a country and a destination, so hypothetically in Southeast Asia, the opportunity for repeat visitation is massive, because they already have that affinity. They have an understanding of the impact that their travel has on those local communities, on those local artisans, on those local gastronomy providers. But then going, as you say, beyond the tier 1 cities, exploring further. So it's new visitation, but also repeat visitation. And this is where, if you could share a little bit, please, about what you're finding governments are doing to rethink their offering to go further afield, so that not only domestic, but repeat visitors can find more to enjoy in the destinations themselves.
Well, community-based tourism, rural tourism is booming. That's in development. I know that in China, they've done massive investment in that. And so when China does open up, I think you'll find a traveler that is looking for something different and more authentic. And so that trend is across our region. For example, in Indonesia, everyone knows Bali, but, the tourism minister talks about 5 new destinations that they want people to be aware of that are across the country and have different cuisines, different cultures, dress, things to discover. And so, I think that, that is something that, we all advocate, because what this does is also, the conscious traveler. We talk about the rise of the conscious traveler post-COVID and during this pandemic. Majority of travelers we've surveyed here in Asia want something that's more, that gives back to the community, to the environment, to the culture, and they'll be seeking that out. And that's a wonderful trend. And, so both coming from the consumers, coming from the enterprise, and coming from the governments, this is a positive direction that we're going.
Indeed.
Yeah, we've talked a lot on the show about the pandemic being an accelerator for already existing trends, so authentic travel, conscious travel, adventure travel, et cetera. I want to shift gears a little bit and ask, has it had the same impact or perhaps a negative impact, by it I mean the pandemic, on women in hospitality? This is a big theme here at the school, as it should be. I think 65% of our students are females. We know that COVID has impacted people's livelihoods and ability to work from home and take care of kids and et cetera at the same time as working. And I'm just wondering, is there any research that you're aware of or any initiatives about how COVID has disproportionately impacted, either favorably or unfavorably, women in hospitality?
Oh, absolutely. It has disproportionately impacted women in hospitality. In our region, somewhere around 54% of the staff are female, but they tend to be the frontliners and in the lower income jobs. And the women tend to stay there, rather than rise up the ranks. So, one of the pilot initiatives that we did as PATA in Thailand is we worked with 500 of these, we call them informal workers, and they might be vendors, tour guides, small hostel workers. And, we did an outreach, giving them health and safety training, teaching them to wear masks properly, to do an antigen test, and also to pivot their business, how to get their business listed online, how to now cater for the domestic tourist, because since the international tourists have been gone for so long. And so that segment is so important for us to do outreach to, and it exists in huge numbers across the region. So I think that's someone who shouldn't be forgotten. I think, we need to help and support that.
And do you think these tools these challenges that we're recognizing and tools that we're trying to provide are short-term solutions, or do you believe that these are long-term benefits that in a hopefully post-pandemic world are going to provide advantages? Or are we going to, one of my concerns is we're just going to forget everything. I've already forgotten how to wear a mask, or that it's that it's strange not to wear a mask. Now it's strange to put one on again. And so I'm wondering, collectively as an industry, do you see us moving forward on these different issues that we've been talking about? Or are you skeptical like me that we're going to fall back into the way things were before and then once again have these challenges when the next crisis hits?
Well, I'll talk about another, way that this tool that has been used. PATA Foundation has supported a mobile-first ed tech program, working with the poorest of the poor students in hospitality. And I actually worked on this prior to my joining PATA about 8 months ago. I was working in education technology. And what we found is that using a tool like that, you can reach the lower income segment because they don't have computers. But everyone, what we find is even in the poorest segment, they have, 80% plus have smartphones. And so that's an important trend that has started that should continue. And it will help evolve those things, so, just as the democratization of education and reaching to those segments that are more remote and less, have less resources, I think is a really critical trend that should continue. And it'll do things like that, as you say, it can, if it's reinforced and expanded, it can help them evolve as things change.
To that point, I'd like to actually just push something out. You have a remarkable universe of members across all the different niches, all the different segments, all the different geographies. And in many ways, I always argue that Mother Nature was a tourism practitioner in her former life. She knows what she's doing. And in many ways, it strengthened the tourism industry, not because of the independence and the interrelationships, but the interdependence. And I can't help but imagine that your leadership role in PATA has evolved since you've come in, because suddenly all the different members that you have appreciate their value to one another in ways that it used to be the destinations, the airlines, the hotels, the associations. And now they create this ecosystem of survival. I'd love to understand what you've seen and how coming out of this, the industry has the potential to be stronger because it's rewired itself out of necessity in a way that hopefully will continue to hold.
I think that's absolutely the case. And because, they're sort of driven by this recovery mission together, and it's very much still work in progress. All of those, the complexities of what has to happen, for example, when a market opens up again, the restoration that needs to occur, the coordination, it's still a learning and work in progress, and I've seen it. But you're right, it forces everyone together. And this is a time not for, even, one of the initiatives that I started when I joined PATA back in June, I had these government-only sessions, and it's for recovery insights, partnering with World Bank. And these destinations that would normally be competing with each other for the attention of travelers, I wanted them to basically share learnings, share what worked and didn't work. And this is an important time for us to, as an industry, to work together in ways that we never have before. And just to, because no one nation can, recover in this by itself. We really need to collaborate and find ways to speed up the learnings that we've had and innovate and support each other.
Especially to your point, the very essence of travel is one person going from one place to another. We need each other both as source markets and destinations. So that unless one decides to go 100% on a domestic tourism strategy, every country in the world needs every country in the world. And so the sooner and smarter we can find those shared solutions, I think I've always found that Asia Pacific and ASEAN especially is amazing in how it supports itself. And I think it was like 65-68% of ASEAN travelers come from ASEAN. So it is that value for regional travel going out. And now it's just rewiring the industry from the inside. So I think you have a very unique perspective. To that point, I'm curious, because you talked about countries opening up carefully. What do you communicate to your members as the first priority for countries to be able to start recovery sustainably?
Oh, I think it's pretty well known across the region. Foundational for recovery is vaccines and vaccine equity. And there's still needs in this continent as well as in Africa. And I think sometimes the Western nations, I'm American by birth and upbringing, and I know what it's like on both sides of the globe. And while the West is celebrating that this is over, we very much still feel it here in the East. And there are still gaps in vaccine. There are still 3 billion people that haven't had a first vaccine. And so it's important to remember that. And they're waiting. They're anxious and they're waiting to get it. They want to be just as protected as the affluent nations. So that's foundational, to protecting the community and the travelers. And so yeah, that's key. And, the ministries across the region have been cognizant of that. So when you sit in a tourism ministry meeting, the first topic is, vaccine progress. Indeed. And I think the important thing, and this is important not just for the individual, lower income countries to recover, but this is global, because this is really a race against variants. The more people that get COVID, the more chances this COVID has a chance to mutate, and so we really need to get ahead of it, and we need to make sure that not just, waiting for governments to sort it out and work it out, but also, individual consumers can do micro donations, multinationals can also support. There really needs to be an all-out effort. And there's been, and another bright spot is that there is a vaccine that is, 2 candidates are up for the Nobel Prize out of Texas, and they came up with a low-cost vaccine that can be easily manufactured. And that's starting already in 2 locations in Asia. So I think that's very important.
It's as we always say, this isn't a travel and tourism crisis, an economic crisis alone. It's a healthcare crisis first. So, Professor, shall we stop being greedy, or immediately stop being greedy, and hand over to our voice of grace for any audience?
Yes, please. Yes, please. Grace, question from our audience?
Yes, we have a question from one of our longtime viewers, Steve. He says, early in the crisis, Australia announced some travel corridors to allow travel from Australia to specific destinations only. Are these corridors still in place? And do you see this idea of a corridor expanding or a concept which is no longer applicable?
Oh, I'm loath to comment on specific guidelines because they change day to day. But I do see the corridors expanding. Certainly, we saw that even Western Australia, which was the most isolated and the most locked down in that country, has opened up. And each country has their individual rules. For example, Japan has, they're limiting, they're not allowing leisure travelers in, but they're allowing students and business travelers, and they've got something like a 10K cap. I haven't looked at the volume restrictions on the VTLs or the corridors in and out of Australia, but certainly I know of a lot of industry colleagues that are flying in there now.
Thanks. Grace, do we have another question?
Yes. What data do you look at to gauge recovery?
That's a good question, because actually in prior years, the destinations, we might have looked in the industry at arrivals or volume of passengers. But now there's a movement towards, we know that travelers are staying longer, doing multi-purpose trips. And so the important, I think, number to start to look at is, how much spend are they doing in the country? How much are they bringing versus just total IVAs or visitor arrivals? So I think the parameters for what we look at, it'll also be very hard to distinguish corporate and leisure. I think it'll very much, all different forms of travel will start to come together. People may not get on a plane every week as they used to in Asia in some jobs, but they'll go on the road and do multiple stops, and they'll go out for 2 months. So that's a form that travel has already started to take and will continue to take.
Good stuff. Another question, Grace.
Yes, we have another question. Why did you leave corporate to take on leadership of PATA, and was it a good decision in hindsight?
So I left corporate. I was with American Express for 18 years. So I left American Express about 18 years ago, and I was really keen to go somewhere to build something, to get into an entrepreneurial space. So I did that the last 4 or 5 years. And then I joined PATA. And I have to say, PATA brings together all these different elements of my background, and in ways that I didn't expect. I love that it's mission-based. I love that I'm a big believer that travel is a force for good. I've been working with a charity hotel restaurant school for the past 10 years, one that's out of Cambodia. So it sort of brought my interests in education, in travel, all together. And I love the network. As Anita pointed out, the PATA network is just mind-boggling in terms of its dimensions. I thought Amex Global Business Travel was big, but this PATA represents every corner of the travel ecosystem. So it is really quite amazing. And I think the strength and the interesting elements of that are just fascinating.
Before I come back to Grace for another question, I wanted to ask you something. We talked about different areas of the hospitality or travel industry working together to come out of this crisis. How about working with firms outside of the industry? Have you seen any moves, especially in the Asian region, of other industries collaborating more with travel and tourism and hospitality? And if so, are those for long-term gains, or are they just short-term solutions? Or are you seeing we're in it on our own in tourism and hospitality?
Well, we call travel an ecosystem. It's it's a sector. It's not an industry, right? We touch so many industries. That's the incredible thing. So, for example, very early on in this pandemic, we saw interesting partnerships, including hospitality, companies like I'm blanking now, like a Lysol and a Mayo Clinic coming together. That convergence of entities that never would have partnered together in the past have come together. right? And so that's like that one very early example. But I do think that, it's hard to, you have to think hard about what industry travel doesn't touch.
Nice.
And I think the innovation that's coming out, whether it's through, whether it's blockchain or, the convergence of tech and solutions that are coming up are happening every day.
Great. All right, I think we have time for another question, Grace.
Yes, we've got time for one more question. What is your message to the RISE audience, re opportunity for their travel in Asia in 2022?
What is, can you repeat that? What is the?
Yes, of course. What is your message to our RISE audience regarding the opportunity for their travel in Asia in 2022?
Oh, I would say the opportunities are there. Do your research, and the hospitality that you'll find in Asia is incredible. I think that what you should do is similar to any other region. It would be to do your homework and reach out to the Indonesia Travel Association. I got to ask the question, what can we do to make travelers feel more comfortable? And I said, create a connection with them, whether it's by email or through WhatsApp. I had a small boutique hotel reach out to me by WhatsApp. So do your research, make the connection, and you'll be rewarded. And, take the time. There are markets that are opening up, and you'll find that the product will be well worth it once you get here.
It's funny you say that, Liz, because we all know that Asian hospitality, and I can generalize, is unique. There's a depth of sincerity and richness in Asian hospitality. And if you think of the world is desperately fatigued and needing to heal, Pacific Asia is an amazing part of the world to start healing in. So I think that, as you said right up front, there's an opportunity there for people to travel, to give themselves what they desperately need as we go into year 3 of what is an incredibly challenging time. So it's lovely having your heart and your science combination at the same stage.
Well, I think you'll find, there is, like, whether it's the Philippines or Thailand or Cambodia, you'll find that there's a pride in hospitality and service. And you'll feel it and you'll see it. And there's an appreciation for welcoming travelers and a pride in their culture. And so you'll experience that when you come to Asia. It's a living example of the term hospitality. So in that, we thank you for being a living example of great leadership and joining us on RISE. And thank you for sharing your brain, your science, your heart, and your perspective on what's happening in the East and why the opportunity for the future of travel is very strongly there. Professor, over to you.
Not much more to say other than, Liz, thanks so much. Really a great perspective and a valuable addition to RISE, and we wish you all the best. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
What an interesting program this has been today, Professor, because we have our systems, we have our knockout, you usually kick my tail. But if you think about it, we've had such intense issues we've had to deal with this episode. And it's an interesting one, thinking that we're 2 years into the pandemic and we're still dealing with incredibly challenging issues that we need our industry to work through, but from a position of intel and insight, but also inspiration. So I thought this was a really, really interesting program this time.
I'm glad you found it interesting, because I find them always interesting.
Oh, shame.
Okay. No, but I think this is an important issue. And in fact, it links into a little bit what we're going to be talking about in 2 weeks with Chip Rogers from the American Hotel Lodging Association. We were going to have Chip on back in season 1, and it didn't work out on our fault. And now I want to say, well, it's been 2 years. Help me understand how the industry is different now. What, not what have we done, et cetera, but going forward, how has this industry evolved, not only for the current crisis, but for future ones? Because like I said before, I feel like we keep having the same discussion, important one, because things, it's not over. It's 2 years. And we joked about this once. Would we have thought 2 years ago we would still be having this show in 2 years? I don't think we would have thought anything of what's been happening would still be around 2 years. So let's talk to someone who's been, fighting the good fight for 2 years and help us understand, what's the next fight? How are we better prepared for the next fight?
It's a great one. And thank you for bringing him on as one of your executives and colleagues, because importantly, we've all said we cannot waste this time. We've been given a chance to re-engineer our industry in a way that is stronger and smarter and more sustainable. And Chip has such a critical role to play in his lobbying position and looking at it from a labor perspective, that he's one of the people who at scale is going to make sure that we are rewiring in a much better way than when we went into 2020 with all of the issues of underpay, overcrowding, all of those battles. So I think it'll be a great one to have Chip on, especially as he is going to be on the eve of our 2nd anniversary program on April the 11th. So on March 28th, everyone please join us, sign up on rise-weekly.com so you can get involved in the polls, in the Q&A, and send questions through to our executives and residents. We have Chip here in 2 weeks' time, exactly for the reasons the good professor has called out. It's about fighting the good fight. And then mark in your calendars, April the 11th, the 2nd anniversary special edition of Rise. And we look forward to having everyone with us then. So until then, from all of us at Rise, before I hand over to the good professor to close off, stay well, stay strong, stay hopeful, keep your hands clean, and stay with Rise. Professor, over to you.
I don't think I've ever been referred to as the good professor, but thank you for that. Thank you again to Liz, to our entire team for putting together this episode, and especially to the audience who tunes in faithfully every 2 weeks. We will see you on the 28th for a great episode. Have a great time until then. Take care.
Take care, everyone. And to you, Nutty Professor.
That I like better.